Good evening, everybody. My name is Gail Thomas Strong, and on behalf of the library and Chalkbeat, I am so pleased to welcome you to our 22nd conversation about education. This one is called Talking About Testing. This is part of shared educational mission work from all three organizations. For WFYI, the American Graduate Initiative, and I know that this work is firmly embedded in the strategic plan of the library and of Chalkbeat. I would want you to know that we're filming this tonight, so if you see it and then you wish you could share it with someone else, it'll take us a day or two, but we'll have this on our website at WFYI. And as the conversation continues, we'll have index cards if you didn't pick up one so that you can ask questions of our guests. We also expect more people will be joining us, so we're looking forward to a great conversation tonight. Scott Elliott, the founding bureau chief of Chalkbeat, Indiana, will be our moderator. He will introduce our guests. Scott, thank you again.
Thank you. Whoop. Oh, you know what? I might just hold it like this. Okay, first of all, you mentioned this already, that we will have comment cards if you want to fill those out. And as we approach the commenting period, you can just hand them to folks who will be coming down the aisle to pick them up. Quick instruction on how the format will work. I'm going to have the candidates, or not the candidates, the election's over, thank God. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves briefly, then I'll do a little bit of Q&A with them, and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay, so introductions first. In the first seat right here is Michelle Walker. Michelle is the Director of Student Assessment for the Indiana Department of Education, sort of the chief of state tests, I guess, for lack of a better term. Whitney Newton, seated next to her, is an instructional coach at Harshman Middle School, one of IPS's science math magnet middle schools, excuse me. Hardy Murphy, Dr. Hardy Murphy, seated next to Whitney, is a professor at IUPUI of the School of Education and at the Center on Education and Lifelong Learning, a joint appointment. Seated next to him is Gavin Craig. Gavin is a student at Covenant Christian High School. What year are you in, Gavin? He's a junior at Covenant Christian High School. Next to Gavin is Dena Cushenberry. Dena is the superintendent for Warren Township Schools. And then on the end is Derek Redelman, who's in transition for work after many years at the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. He's now going to USA Funds very shortly. So let's thank all the panelists for being here. Thank you. So I think to start out, testing is this process that we've had for a long time. And it's only recently become somewhat more controversial, I'd say, over the last decade or decade and a half, particularly in the in the aftermath of No Child Left Behind, which really changed the way we did testing in the country. It's become increasingly a debated topic. So I think I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to just we'll just go right on down the line, take 3 minutes or so, and just tell us your thoughts on testing, how you sort of feel about standardized testing and where you maybe stand on that debate. Michelle, you're in an awkward position as someone who's in charge of it, but maybe no you can just tell us from your perspective. You're actually in quite an interesting perspective because you run the state testing system, and you also work for a state superintendent who at times has been skeptical of some elements of testing. So maybe you can just start there.
So I think obviously our primary purpose is to really let parents and teachers know how students are doing. How can we actually inform instruction and improve learning is the whole purpose of testing. I think one of the things that we're blessed to have in our state is not just the required testing, but some tools for teachers. One of the things that the state board actually implemented in 2006 when the legislature at that time required that they create an assessment system. They had the foresight to really think about tools for teachers, not just the high stakes tests that we need. So a lot of good has come from that in the classroom. People have become more data driven. I know that's kind of a term that becomes coined, but I think, in fact, listening to Whitney talk about some of her ideas about her dissertation around data use really excited me and made me feel good about that.
Great. Whitney, you're an instructional coach, so so tell us a little bit about what an instructional coach does first. You work with teachers or students is your primary work?
Primarily, I work with teachers. I work with students occasionally for RTI purposes, but I'm also the testing coordinator at our school, so I support our teachers in being excellent and being a thought partner for them and growing as excellent as they can be. And then in coordinating testing, I spend the whole year providing acuity testing, state tests, ISTEP, ECAs, all those things that our students take. So my position on testing is, so I'm doing my dissertation on databases, and I think that data is a really important part of being a great teacher and knowing where your students are. I think the very best teachers don't need a database to tell them how their students are doing because they're spending every minute in the class assessing it. But some of us, myself included, need those numbers and need to be able to look at them and align them with what we see with our students. So I think there is a fine line between, I guess my position is that there's a fine line between data that helps me be a great teacher and an enormous amount of testing that our kids go through every day. So I'm kind of walking that line right now at our school.
Thank you. Dr. Murphy, could you tell us a little bit? I know some of your work, we should tell a little bit more about you. You're previously been a superintendent in Evanston, Illinois, is that correct?
That's correct.
While you were there, the district was noted for improving it, reducing the achievement gap between different subgroups of students. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on testing and where we stand today.
I think that testing provides useful information if it's used for the right purposes. I think we have to be careful with it because, as we know, it can be very divisive in terms of the relationship at the school level and at the community level between school leadership and the parents and other stakeholders in the community. I think the most important thing about it is that if it is used to inform the planning and delivery of instruction, then it can help to build relationships between students and their teachers. And I think that what we have to do is make sure that we package that information in a way that it's not misinterpreted and that people understand that along with the testing that goes on, that this is only a part of what happens in schools. There's a lot more to what makes for a successful school experience for students than just their test scores. And I think we need to recenter the discussion between all of the things that that happens in schools and what happens as a result of testing.
Thank you. So Gavin, at Covenant Christian High School, which is a private high school, do you take the ECAs?
Yes, we do. I just took the ECA for English 10 last year. That was the only one that I took, though.
And you loved it and had a great experience, right?
Huh? Oh, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
In all seriousness, I would love to know more about what you think of where we stand. I mean, if you're in, sorry, you said you were a junior, right?
Yes.
So if you're a junior in high school, you've lived through quite a bit of testing, probably state testing and other testing in your schooling life. What's your sort of attitude toward it and views about it?
I think that testing is, I think it's tricky. I like what you said about misinterpreting the, like being very careful not to misinterpret the information, because essentially, you know, what you're doing is you're putting numbers to students, and you're going to hear this from every teenager, and I'm sorry about that, but you're quantifying the students with those numbers, and I think that that is really the best way that you can do it, because you can't qualify every student in the nation, but I think that I don't think that should be the final defining basis that you have for all the students. I think it's very important, you know, seeing where each student kind of stands in like particular subjects, and I think it's very good for like learning like what should we focus on as a school, what should we focus on as a class, what should I focus with this student on, and I think it's very helpful in that sense. But I think it's something we definitely need to be more careful with.
Thanks. Dr. Cushenberry, so now you've been the superintendent there. Is this your second year? Is that correct?
Third.
Excuse me, it's your third year. Wow, time is flying.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about your views on testing. You've worked on the teaching and administrative side of the fence here. Where do you stand on this idea?
Well, to me, data is important, but with No Child Left Behind, I think it was the first time that every student was included. And so it was real important to me that the special needs students, EL students, everyone was respected in the assessment system. So for me, testing is inclusive, and that was important. But right now, I think because we're in this global society, we really do need to know how we compare and how our students do, not only in our schools, but in our states. And the one issue I had with kind of our reluctance to continue with the Common Core was pretty soon you will see gaps in states. And we want to always make sure our students have the advantage. And so that's how I see testing right now.
Thanks. Derek Relman, you've been an advocate for, I would say, standards and testing-based school reform in Indiana for quite a long while. In your work at the Chamber of Commerce, you represented sort of the business interests on this issue, which is a very strong proponent of that particular brand of school reform. Tell us about the rationale. Where's the business community coming from and the folks who agree with them on this issue? What is their sort of stated goal with this type of reform?
Well, there are a lot of goals, and you're right, the business community has been very supportive of standards-based education reforms for a long time, and assessments are just a critical component of that. And I think part of what drives the business community interest is students coming, or graduates, frankly, coming to them having a diploma in hand or having said that they've taken certain courses or accomplished certain things, and getting very different results that when they would do a placement test or a test through their hiring process at what I think some of these employers consider to be pretty low levels, oftentimes at 8th grade level or even lower, and these are young folks with diplomas in hand, and that's what drove their interest back in I think it was the 80s, in supporting a graduation exam, which is one of the components of that. I think we also hear in business, and it's not just in manufacturing. I think people tend to default all the time to just the manufacturing of widgets, and so when business folks talk, they think that they're just comparing students to widgets. But in every form of business, even in very human-oriented work, there are a lot of measures of what gets done, and we heard the comments along the lines here. Almost every single person said there is value to having that data and being able to make decisions and adjust curriculum and just knowing where your students are, et cetera. But I think what I think I also heard, and certainly I think the concern is shared by others, including folks in the business community, is how do the data get used? And that gets into what happened with No Child Left Behind. Whether all of the concerns about No Child Left Behind were real or not, at least the perception, without question, was a lot of pretty ugly stuff. But it all boils down to how it gets used. The other thing, too, though, is I think we need to be careful when we talk about assessments. What probably most of us are talking about, I know certainly Michelle and I, are talking about the main assessments that the state gives. Kids are tested all the time, though, and there are a lot of assessments that teachers are giving, that schools are given, that are not required, but they've been given voluntarily by the teacher or the school district. And there are some folks who are starting to help schools kind of catalog all of those assessments now, and helping schools to understand that, wow, those hours and hours and hours and hours of testing that students are taking that everyone seems to complain about, maybe you don't need all of that. It's certainly not required by the state or by the feds or anyone else. So there are a lot of different aspects to it.
But when you don't know what the assessment is, then you're going to do multiple things just to make sure you're on target. So once schools know and understand what is going to be assessed, then we really can eliminate some of those unnecessary kinds of things. But you're right, teachers are every day giving those formative assessments and checking for understanding. But what we know about the rigor of this exam coming, we just want to make sure we're preparing our students.
And I think that's part of the problem, because what you describe is what happens. And a lot of that is the apprehension of how a particular teacher's students are going to perform on the test. And I think that's indicative of the atmosphere that our schools operate in now. And I think if you look out for what the purpose of schools, what they're here to do, they're here to, I believe, is to prepare students to be productive citizens in our society. The assessment process along the way should be used to help develop those young people so that when they do step out into their communities and into the workforce, they're able to make the kind of contribution that moves the values of the American way along. And I think sometimes what has happened to us is that we've become so focused on this proficiency model that we forget that we are really dealing with individual personalities that are developing as they go through our school system. And I think those kinds of things have to be recentered in this whole idea of what tests are and how they're used.
Well, and the whole A through F, once, schools are not graded A through F, then we can get to that. But as long as you have a label, a letter, a number put on a school, some of those things, we are preparing our kids to be those democratic citizens, but when a parent is coming to town and they're looking for a great school, they're certainly not going to go where there's an F.
But why should they?
Well, because sometimes the F may not be a true F. We have a school right now, but because of the mobility, has gone from an A to a D, an A to a D. That doesn't tell me anything about that school. That just says that when they were doing the growth model, this school didn't get as much growth from the kids as they did the year before. Nowhere should it go from an A to a D.
What steps have you taken to try to address mobility? There are strategies that you can use there to perhaps try to stabilize the enrollment of the school. Have you tried to do that?
We haven't really redone our district just yet because we're not 5 years in, but we do sometimes redistrict to balance that out. We have a group of parents that really like that school, and when they find others, so it's a concentrated area and people are just safe and secure there, but we also put lots of tutoring in, extended day, put in extra time for reading, language arts, interventions. We do all those things, but with all of that, you still have that up and down.
Let me bring the conversation quickly back to Michelle Walker for just a moment, because I feel like I want to take a step back and let's talk a little bit about what the changes that have been occurring in Indiana and where we're headed, right? So there's a exciting / terrifying change about to occur, depending on your point of view. We're going to very different kinds of tests, and we're doing it very fast. By the spring, we're going to be using tests that have what are called technology-enhanced questions on them. This is a very different kind of computerized question that, for instance, allows the student to manipulate the screen, move things around. They hope that that this sort of test will be able to show how the student is thinking, how they construct their answer to the question, not just did they get a right or wrong answer. So that sounds very exciting. One of the critiques of standardized testing is that they're not the smartest instruments in the world, that they're often multiple choice, there's often quite a lot of guessing. In fact, if you take test prep programs, they will teach you how to guess. That's one of the great strategies of test prep, okay? So there's that. So maybe this is an exciting new era coming with tests that maybe have some advantages over the tests we've used in the past. On the other hand, in our reporting, we've talked to teachers who are very rattled by the changes that are coming. They feel like they haven't had enough time to prepare for it. This is going to be a really different world, and they are afraid that at least the first year and maybe a couple of years, scores will really suffer as students are facing different kinds of questions and to some degree different expectations because of the way the test is designed. So what can you tell us about the goals of the state right now and how it's addressing those pluses and minuses?
So I think the biggest thing to think about is college and career ready standards. So once we adopted those new standards, we really needed to align our assessment to those standards. I think several folks have talked about really aligning instruction to ensure students are learning what they need to know and be able to do for life, not just for a test. Certainly, we had the Common Core state standards adopted in 2010, so having a college and career ready type of standard has not been new for Indiana. I think the fact that we're actually going to start using items that leverage the technology and that really enable us to better understand what students are thinking really gives students more opportunities to demonstrate what they know and can do.
So do you think that in the long run, this test will achieve the goals that we've sort of, I mean, I remember way back when Barack Obama started running for president in 2008, he used to often say, we need new kinds of tests, to the point where I desperately tried to get in front of him to ask him a question about what he thought those new kinds of tests look like. Well, here they are. These are the new tests. Do you feel optimistic that we're about to enter a new world where the standardized testing is maybe higher quality?
I do. I think because we do have the opportunity, again, to leverage technology. There are students that may need a paper pencil version, perhaps due to a disability. So we're really trying to model those items that can be ported over to paper, but that can really get, again, at those deeper understandings. And trying to provide a lot of support for the teachers along the way. We hope they're using the resources we provided on the web. We've done pretty extensive practice items, webinars for teachers to listen to and really understand how to use the new item types.
Last night we had a different panel discussion here. There was a film which I would describe as quite critical of standardized testing in general, followed by a panel with several parents on it who raised a lot of concerns about how testing has reshaped the way their children are taught. For instance, we mentioned acuity testing. I think Whitney, you mentioned acuity testing. Acuity tests, I think, are given every like 3-4 weeks in some cases. Or sorry, acuity, I think
3 times a year.
3 times a year. But then districts often use supplemental acuity style tests as often as 3 times every 3 weeks. In fact, Warren Township was one of the pioneers in this area of that particular method. So there was a lot of frustration from the parents who were on the panel saying that has narrowed what's expected of children to this very sort of test prep style of day-to-day teaching. Are you worried about that?
I'm not worried. I think because we're blessed to live in a state where our test is actually going to measure what we expect teachers to teach. So we're not measuring standards that aren't ours. All of our items are exactly aligned to our standards. They're approved by teachers in advance before they ever show up on an assessment. I think the challenge is helping students, teachers, parents really understand that the standards are the assessment, and they're really combined and should be seen as one.
Whitney, let me ask you, what's the biggest obstacle to getting a child to pass a test who has not passed before? Like, when you see that student, what is your goal?
It depends on the child. So we have a pretty high ESL population. So for those students, it's comprehension of the English language as they're reading. If it's a student with a special needs, it could be a myriad of things from reading to, if it's the math test now, with the readiness test, it's probably reading as well, in addition to whatever math deficits they have. And I think I was a math teacher, and so I think that I often see it as there's a foundational conceptual knowledge missing for a lot of our kids, and that might be true in language arts as well. I'm not as familiar with that, but with our students, when they come to a math test, just fundamentally approaching a problem to problem solve it, they don't know where to start. And so they click a button or they multiply the numbers in the problem, and if they get an answer that's there, that's the one that they click. So I think that the biggest challenge in getting a child to pass is truly digging into who the child is and what they need, and looking at all of the pieces of data, not just one, not just whether they passed or not, but what kind of learner are they, how do they approach test taking, what do they think about themselves, what are they thinking while they're testing. All of those things are important for a teacher to know in getting them to pass the test, but that takes a lot of time. And this year, 70% of my job is testing. It is not, I'm not supporting our teachers as much as I would like to, because in the next 3 weeks after Thanksgiving break, I will administer 6 tests to 2 grade levels in 3 weeks before the holiday break. And that I can't do my job in supporting teachers, because I'm spending all of my time printing test tickets and cutting them and making sure kids are in the right place for a test.
Let's say, for example, we had a student in your school is grades 7 through
7 and 8.
Sorry, 7 and 8. So actually, your school's a great example of this problem. So 7th grader comes in the door, and the first time you give them a diagnostic test, they test at, let's say, 5th grade level, right? So I understand what you're saying. Like, this is a great difficulty. What that's going to trigger is a ongoing process of testing and retesting and assessing and trying to figure out how to support the student and give them extra resources, et cetera. But the argument from the protesting side would be that's exactly the appropriate thing to do with a child that's 2 years behind. Like, shouldn't that trigger, in essence, a red alert? I mean, that's, if you're in 7th grade and you're 2 years behind, you're probably in danger of not graduating. So why does it matter that there's this testing-driven alarm? Shouldn't there just be an alarm?
I think what the teacher, from the teacher's perspective, so as a math teacher, I want to spend time with that child, but I can't spend time with them if they're taking acuity for 85 minutes. I have to watch them take a test. I can't interact with them in order to make it a testing environment. So there is a red alarm, and my hands are tied because my time isn't being spent one-on-one or in small groups or being able to differentiate, because we're literally gearing up for the next test. I'm spending my time giving directions instead of actually working with the child. So I think practically that's what it can often look like is, yes, test and retest to see where they are. I don't have enough time in between to get them ready for the next test.
So it's just too much in your view? Like, for instance, if you did it, you probably should, with a student who maybe hasn't had, let's say, straight A's the prior year, you probably want a diagnostic test for the student coming in.
I would want one for every child.
Okay, so starting them off with a diagnostic test seems like a good idea. You just think that from that point, when we get the initial information about where they stand and we begin the strategy of trying to intervene to get them up to grade level, we don't necessarily have to jump to another test quite so quickly. We could have more time in between. That would give you the time to do your job. Is that a fair?
Or if they were chunked and they were smaller, if they were able to be given in the classroom by the teacher, and the teacher could, the turnaround time could be faster. I mean, all of those things, efficiency in the process and allowing it to be out of the teacher's time that they're spending with the child, so that it doesn't come out of instructional time. If there was a way to make that work, then that would be ideal.
I got it. Just add more hours to the day. There's the plan, right? Like 25 hours, right? And then we got it all covered. Dr. Hardy, I'm very interested to talk with you about your work in Evanston. So one of the stingiest problems in all of education is closing the achievement gap. There's been lots of strategies, and if you look at the long-term trend, it's frustratingly persistent problem. Tell us what sort of strategies you put in place in Evanston that seem to make a difference there, since you guys in that district made some improvements.
Well, I think we made some progress. I learned some things. I had some successes. There were times when I wasn't as successful as I would like to have been. And the interventions and supports went across the board, from professional development to teachers, to after-school programs, to using assessments in a formative manner to make sure that the curriculum standards were being taught, to ensuring that teachers had data at their fingertips and that they were able to use it to make plans for students, to engaging schools and plans and working with their teachers to craft their own professional development. Throughout this process, I think assessments of one form or another have been very valuable. There's nothing insidious about the assessments in and of themselves. It's how they're used and the motivation for their use and actually what they're used for. I traced the experiences that we're having in this country with assessments back to two general concerns. When the country is going through an economic crisis, and I'm back to the business industry at this point, if you looked at what was happening during the 80s, A Nation at Risk emerged, and the conclusion was that the American system of public education needed to be improved. And I think we can always stand room for improvement, but even though we bewail the plight of the American worker, the fact of the matter is that America gave the world the internet during this same time period. So there's a great deal of creativity that resides within the minds and hearts of the students in our community and the teachers in our schools and our classrooms. The other one is the pervasive and ongoing concern about how do we address the achievement gap and ensure equity for every child that's born into this country, so that it might in fact fulfill the promises that it makes to all of us who are fortunate enough to be here. Unfortunately, one thing that the tests do show is that you can predict student success based upon their demographics. And that ranges from race and ethnicity. They're very prickly things to grapple with because those are matters of the heart as much as they are of the mind, to poverty. And that's a very insidious lack of equity in the distribution of opportunity and those things that nurture children from the earliest stages on. What we moved to was a belief that you have to, in fact, make sure that your system addresses everything from pre-K to preparing students for high school and beyond. Part of what drives this, for those parents on one end of the continuum who are concerned about how well their students perform on college preparatory exams, they're very informed. They want to make sure that their children have an opportunity to get into great institutions of learning, because once they finish those schools, they have an opportunity to get good jobs and lead very productive lives. There's another parent who may not be so informed. And for those parents, if you're talking about A to F, what they want to know is that their child is in a classroom with a teacher that cares about them, someone who has a passion for the curriculum, someone who has a passion for the subject matter that they're teaching, someone who's able to engage and inspire their children and help their students to become passionate about learning. We realized that what you had to do was to try to engage parents in some very aggressive parental involvement programs to give them a voice and what's happening in their child's education. So we did that, and then we pulled in the community. We had all of the foundations in the community to come together to help fund an early childhood initiative. We started preparing children from the earliest stages of their development on. And the community actually developed something where we looked at providing supports for young mothers and young parents, even before the children got into schools. The idea here is that there are major institutions in our communities. Education is one of them. But it does require, I believe, all of the institutions in the community to come together with a singular purpose, and that's to make sure that every child that's born in the community, if it's Indianapolis, has an opportunity to succeed in life.
Thank you. Gavin, I wanted to ask you about what you hear about testing from your classmates and your peers, folks who are in your age, all through your life. Again, you guys have lived through this this different world, different than everyone else on the stage lived through in terms of being a No Child Left Behind world, primarily in school. What's sort of the prevailing view of this from the student level?
You see, you hear a lot of, enraged teenagers who are so against testing, who are so against, just doing this because it's like, oh, you're putting numbers on us. You're not really caring about the student, and that's really the predominant thing I hear from a lot of people my age. People don't like testing. It's not fun. It's difficult, and we can get punished if we get bad numbers. And the thing that I think about it is, you can't do it really any other way. You need to be able to quantify all these kids with these test results, because there's not really another good way to do it. A lot of the things that I hear from parents and teachers is, you have to do this. This is a lot of things that we went through. We took tests. We didn't take as many tests as you. So I see that there's obviously a trend of we got to test. And I don't know. I laughed when you said that we're going on theories about how do we guess the best. We got to go back to the point, we're not trying to get good grades. We're trying to educate the students. That's the most important thing. And I think that that's the main concern here, is what's more important, the grade or the knowledge?
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. Yeah. I'm reminded of, I think this was 2 years ago, I went out to Arlington High School's graduation here in Indianapolis. Arlington at the time, this was prior to being taken over by the state. This is a school that only had 100 graduates. I think they started with a class several times the size of that. And then of the 100 graduates, only about half of them were actually able to pass the state test. The rest had been given a waiver. And it was very interesting to talk student by student to them about the fairness of their quote unquote test label, right? And I remember two students in particular. One who had actually a very thoughtful plan for their future. Like they already had identified. They basically said, I know where I'm going and what I want to do. Like I'm ready to leave Arlington. I know I didn't pass this test, but just give me the diploma. Let me go to a program I have in mind and on to the career I want to go to. I was actually quite impressed by his sort of life plan, for lack of a better term. And then another one who was just very angry about being labeled and said it was unfair, but really was not able to pin down for me his own vision of his future, right? And so I'm interested in what you think. This is probably the most common thing when I talk to a student your age, is they'll say like they'll say those sorts of things. You know, that this test is meaningless to me. It doesn't define me. Even if I get a low score or high score, like I've got a future in mind. I'm chasing toward that future. This is getting in the way of me getting to that future. Do you hear that from your fellow students, and what do you think of that argument?
Yes, I do hear that a lot. In fact, I know of a particular student who would say, you know, education as a whole just puts kids in a box, and it quantifies them, and that's not the right thing to do. I definitely don't agree with that. I think that testing is a very important thing. I would agree that it does put numbers to us, and I'm impressed by the kid who, I have my future planned out. I'm not going to let this define me, because some kids are good at testing and some kids aren't, and I think that's probably a big struggle for you, is like making the tests. So how do you make it so that everybody's on an equal playing ground? Because kids aren't on an equal playing ground. A lot of the environments that we take the tests in are all different, and I know this was the first year I had a test where like questions at the end asked me questions about what my testing environment was like, because they wanted to make sure, is everybody have the same environment of testing, and it makes me wonder, like, what's the real goal here? We're looking for better members of society. We're looking for more intelligent members of society, and you can't lower the standard to make that happen. That's not getting us anywhere.
I'm going to ask you one more question on this, because this is just an interesting topic to me to talk with someone who's in school about. So I agree with you. Like, to me, those two students were sort of like best case scenario, worst case scenario,
Yeah.
right? The best case scenario kid, I think, probably was going to be okay. The worst case scenario kid, I worried what was next for him, right? But do you think it's fair, as sort of, because I'm sure Derek will make this point in a moment, that we're in essence setting like a bottom, right? Like, you've got to come out of high school with at least this level of proficiency, right?
Yeah.
Is that a fair expectation?
I think yes. I think that we should have, a basis of knowledge. Like, people should know X amount of things, and that obviously depends on the society that they live in. And I think it's fair to ask that of them. When I think it crosses the line when it gets to the point of like, I'm going to value you as a student more. Like a college says, I'm going to value you as a student more because your number is higher than this student's number. But I definitely think that there should be a basis, a line that everybody has to cross.
Dr. Cushenberry, I'm interested in your thought on that same kind of question. Are we fairly setting sort of a minimum line that it's fair to expect students to achieve?
I think there certainly should be a baseline. There should be a minimum standard for kids to graduate. But I think that minimum standard for each kid could be a little different. I don't believe right now that the elimination of the IMAS test for special needs students is appropriate. So those students will have to take this same rigorous exam with no transition, and I don't see the value in that. So to answer that question, I believe students should leave high school, college, and career ready, at least career ready, whatever that means.
I'm sure Derek knows the answer. Derek, I'm guessing you have a somewhat different point of view on this question of whether it's fair to set a minimum sort of test standard, whether the test actually answers the question that, yes, the student is ready for the next level. What's your take on that?
Well, I think you're touching upon the right word, which is minimums. I mean, we are not talking tonight really about advanced placement exams or rigorous other college admissions exams. We're talking about a set of standards that is considered the minimum, and frankly, with cut scores that have been proven to be pretty low. You know, we used to give a high school graduation exam. We've moved to end of course exams. Now we're going to move back to grade by grade exams, going up to the 10th or 11th grade. But we used to give an exam in the 10th grade that was supposed to determine whether a kid had learned enough to graduate from high school, the 12th grade. That exam was based on 9th grade English standards and based on 8th grade math standards. We had a long debate on whether algebra ought to be added because people ask, well, what's the first course someone takes that's considered high school level? And you say, well, it must be Algebra 1. And so it was this long debate, this is probably 10 years ago, long debate on whether we ought to include algebra or not. Finally said, well, yeah, we ought to include algebra. So they added algebra, then they decided, well, how much algebra? And they decided, well, let's make it 30% of this high school graduation exam will be algebra. Then they set the cut scores. You only had to get 40% of the questions right in order to pass the test. So you think about that, only 30% of the test are algebra questions, and you only had to get 40% of the questions right to pass it, which meant you didn't have to know any algebra at all. But we were running around telling everyone, oh, wow, we made this big jump. We're now requiring algebra for kids to graduate from high school, when we really weren't. You know, I understand that, I mean, we want all kids to, no matter where they are in their achievement levels, to be having some plans. But you also, I think, get into a challenge of kids who may have great aspirations that, frankly, just aren't realistic if they aren't making some sort of minimum achievement levels. 25 years ago, the Lilly Endowment funded a study through the Indiana Youth Institute that really dove into what kids were expecting to do when they left high school. And the report, massive report that they put out, the report was appropriately named High Hopes, Long Odds. Because what it showed was, in a very widespread way, students, and this was all in Indiana, students in Indiana had great aspirations of what they wanted to do. Every one of them, by 8th or 9th grade, was planning to go to college. Every one of them had, not every one of them, but a lot of them had good career expectations. But the courses that they were taking weren't going to get them there. And so it's great that they have those aspirations, but if they aren't driven towards some minimum achievement levels, those aspirations are going to be busted. And we worry about how the kids are going to feel when they're getting through high school. Well, the real world's not as sympathetic. If they get to the end of high school and they want to go, pursue a post-secondary credential of some sort, and I'm not just talking about 4-year degrees, I'm talking about 1-year credentials, 2-year associate degrees, or they even want to go apply for a job. Even those really line-level jobs that students can go to that might not require an extra degree, they're going to get tested. And if they can't do some of these basics, they're not going to get a job, and then reality will set in. I'd rather reality set in earlier, and we try to drive them towards something that will help them be successful and give them opportunities in life.
Let me ask you this question. this came up in last night's discussion here after the film. And I'm going to use my favorite. I'm normally very anti-jargon. If you ask my reporters, I delete jargon out of their stories all the time and tell them to rewrite it into some kind of English. But here's a favorite jargon word of mine, psychometrician. That's the name of the scientist who builds a standardized test. They're called a psychometrician. So every psychometrician will tell you that a standardized test, such as the test that we use as graduation requirements in Indiana, should not be used in a high-stakes way. That these instruments are created in order to give you general information about how one student compares to another set of students, but that it cannot answer the question, is a student ready to graduate? So are we doing a disservice to students by using the tests in that way when the test makers themselves will tell us not to do that?
I think there's frankly, a little bit of PR going on here. That these are folks who are needing to sell their products to schools, and I think if they suggest that their products be used in ways that their customers don't think they should be used, then that's probably not very good for business. So I doubt they're out there
You
saying,
think they're not
"Oh,
being
yeah."
honest?
Excuse me?
They're not being honest about it when they say that?
Well, I don't think that even the testing companies will emphasize that. You'll hear, even you ask the testing company, well, should your test be used for your graduation determination? A lot of times they'll kind of dodge the question because they want to sell their product. They don't necessarily want to be in that policy-making business. And if a state wants to have a graduation exam, for example, or some other sort of high-stakes exam, they'll try to build the best one they possibly can for that purpose. And frankly, there's some very good tests. I mean, the testing gets a really bad name. We talk about the guessing that we've heard here, and a well-built test is guess-proof. You can't guess your way through a test and get good results. So they'll build a good test, but they'll be careful on those questions to them on whether they should be used that way or not.
I have to challenge you on that one.
Okay.
And let me tell you a story about a young man about my age named Scott, who was growing up in New Jersey. And I took very close to Princeton University, where this testing company called the Princeton Review was founded. And this student took the SAT and got a very ordinary score. And then his parents paid quite a lot of money for him to be one of the very first students ever to take the Princeton Review. That course taught, the main strategy they taught was how to guess right, how to narrow the questions down, how to recognize a trap question, a question that's designed to fool you into picking it. And that student's score went up significantly after taking the test.
Well, wait a minute. You just described some things that aren't guessing.
Different
I
kind
mean,
of
you
test.
talked about analyzing how to rule things out. That's not teaching you how to guess. That's teaching you how to figure out what the right answers are. And so I'm not sure that that's a real fair analogy there.
So do you know what in the test making industry? Do you know what a wrong answer is called?
It's a distraction.
A distractor. I think that's an interesting word.
Oh, you mean within the question? Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
what you have, if you're a test maker, if you're a psychometrician, I would tell you this question has one right answer and 4 distractors. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a very purposeful word because this is something that the student in question learned when they were taking the course was that the reason why students often pick the wrong question is because the distractor question, there's typically a range of distractors. Some are intended to be obviously wrong, and there's always one that's intended to be very attractive, right?
Sure.
And so many students pick that question because it seems like a right answer. It's very intentionally designed to look that way. So is that fair?
Well, so they do things like, I'll use one example, a very simple example. 17 plus 18. Well, we all know the answer is 35. Hope it is. One of the answers that they will likely give you as a possibility, a so-called distractor, would be 25. Well, why would they do that? They're going to test whether the student remembered to carry their 1. That's a very purposeful distractor, as you call it, or purposeful wrong answer, however you want to describe it. And it is a part of the learning process that you do want to make sure the student learned or did not learn. Now, good test results, when then given back to the schools and the teachers and the parents, will be able to look at a battery of questions that were along those lines and say, hey, we've got a pattern here. This student didn't carry their one. They're not going to give just a random answer. They're not going to say, 17 plus 18 and your choices are 35, 117, 80. They're going to give you answers that are close, because a good test is, one, going to be challenging. You can't guess. Two, they're going to test you on certain mistakes that you might commonly make. And hopefully, the test results are giving you the feedback to the parents and the teachers on what that mistake is, so they can go work on it.
Let me give
Thinking about the purpose of distractors, I guess, for a moment.
Yeah.
Really, they're designed to discriminate between those students who really know the skill or the knowledge or the ability and those who don't. That's the purpose of the distractors.
I'm going to give you another example, and then we'll move on from this, because I could talk about it all day. So when I was working in Ohio, I wrote a story in which I used this was a 4th grade reading comprehension question that had been discontinued. So it had actually been on the state test and been discontinued. And it was about John Glenn, who, of course, the favorite son of Ohio. And in the passage, it described how John Glenn joined the Navy in order to be a fighter pilot and later became an astronaut. So the first question was, why did John Glenn join the Navy? And options were to become a fighter pilot, and another option was to become an astronaut. It's a 4th grade question. Now, every 4th grader in Ohio knows that John Glenn was an astronaut. And it seems entirely plausible that to a 4th grader that becoming a fighter pilot might be the first step toward being an astronaut. And it is impossible just about for a 4th grader to understand that when John Glenn joined the Navy, there was no such thing as an astronaut. See what I mean? Like, when we asked children how they got to that answer, it was fascinating to hear them talk about that. By the way, another funny thing was the question talked about Glenn joining the Navy and then becoming a Navy pilot. And one of the parents in the room quickly pointed out that John Glenn was never in the Navy, he was in the Marines. Now, he did go to Navy flight school, but the question was actually had incorrect information. But this is probably a particularly bad question, but the point is that distractor, I thought, is a great example of a plausible wrong answer where, like, the child's instinct to pick that question is a pretty good instinct. They're using something they both read in the passage and they know about John Glenn from their own life to make a decision, but it's still wrong.
Well, you're not going to get me defending every test and every question, because I've seen plenty of sample questions too, and some of them stuck on the internet, others that my own kids have brought home that I've gagged on and pointed out that it could go either way or that they were just wrong, and so I'm not going to defend, but to paint a broad brush and to say every question on every test is done like that, yeah, I think is probably unfair.
I agree. I think the fair question is whether that test-making process of trying to create attractive, distracting wrong answers is a fair one and results in a fair representation of a student's work. Gavin, what do you think? When you hear everything we just said, does this process seem fair to you in terms of how it produces results?
Yeah, so I'm in a class right now that every Friday we talk about test taking skills, and we look at these answers. So let's say 17 plus 18, and every answer that it had, it gave a reason why it was wrong. 25. This isn't right because you have to carry the 1. I think that with every problem, there's a set of skills that you need to know to get to the right answer. And I think distractors are fair choice, or are fair, because if they're all answers that aren't distracting or answers that don't look like they could be right, no one's going to choose those answers. They're only going to get the right answer just through guessing, which obviously isn't good. So I think distractors are really fair. I think they're necessary.
But by the way, so and Michelle can talk a lot more about this than I can, but we're reaching the point in testing technology and being able to do much better testing at an affordable price. That's been one of the challenges. That will get away from all of this testing. Indiana's moving this way, as are most states in the country, where we're going to be doing things called constructed response, meaning that the student, all the educators on the panel know exactly what that is, but that's where instead of having a set of choices, you're going to answer the question. So you're not going to have 18 plus 17 equals, and then you have 5 choices. You're going to fill it out. You're going to figure it out. Now, in the past, grading thousands and thousands of tests that are done that way could have been very expensive. And Indiana went back and forth on how much money we were going to spend on testing, which was drove a lot on how much of the open-ended constructed response questions that we could have on it. But now we're moving to the point where I think a big chunk, I'm hesitant to say majority, I don't know, maybe Michelle can tell, but where the testing is moving much more towards that open-ended approach.
And greater depths of knowledge. And so that's where it's going.
So Whitney, teachers must be thrilled to hear about these new kinds of tests that are going to be so much more progressive. What is the teacher reaction to what's coming?
I mean, I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of what you said at the beginning about there not being enough turnaround time. I mean, it's a whole new set of skills to teach students. If I teach a student how to answer a multiple choice question, we'll do a little bit of what you're talking about in being able to avoid distractors. But if I tell them there are going to be drop-down menus, there are going to be multiple right answers that you can click, there are going to be things where you have to drag the text from the passage down into the question. Now I have to teach them how to use the mouse. I have to teach them so many more things about what to do on the screen than the actual content. And so now I'm using more time, so we're back to efficiency, right? From a teacher's perspective, my time is being spent on something that isn't math or language arts.
So now let me ask you a question. That's a really fair point, I think. But is it a short-term problem? Because we know we're on this compressed time schedule this year, and frankly, it wasn't really the state's idea. The state's doing it because of various external pressures, let's put it that way. And also, like, once you, as a school and the teachers that you work with get used to teaching it that way, will we overcome that initial problem, and will this maybe ultimately prove to be a better instrument?
I think it's only a short-term problem for the students who would already learn it quickly. I don't think it's a short-term problem for a lot of our students who might come from schools who will have a permanent sub all year, who might come from a school where the teacher didn't spend the time teaching them how to use the tools. So I think it's a long-term problem for kids who are put in situations where they don't get the same and equitable opportunity towards learning how to use that test. So every year now, and by the time they get to the 7th grade, we often do have kids who still have never learned how to save a document. They've never learned how to type on a keyboard on the computer. So I don't think that it's a short-term problem for every kid.
Dena, what do you think? Sorry, I should call you Dr. Cushenberry, like I'm addressing the others. From your perspective, you're dealing with teachers from the other end of the spectrum. You're not the student, the teacher, instructional coach level, but as their boss. What's your answer to teachers who are raising these very concerns, like this is a different world, we don't know if our students are ready, we don't think it's a short-term problem? What are you saying to them?
Well, when we moved to Common Core and then back to the college and career ready standards, well, we had already started down the journey of greater depth of knowledge, of more modeling, more evidence-based, more complex texts. So we had already started down that journey. So right now, as a district, again, we received that $28.5 million grant. So we've been able to pull outside resources in to really support our teachers. But what she said that is important, even with a lot of money, you still have to give teachers time to really understand what these standards are saying. And we really have to give students time to say, we're going to be teaching you differently, and you're going to have to do some shifting, and we're going to help you shift through modeling. And until you do that, we have some really bright kids who have taken acuity, and it's knocked their socks off. But it's not because they're not smart, and kids don't see that. It's because they have to do this test a different way. They must, really look at a couple of texts and be able to infer. Kids have never had to do that before on a test.
The test our students just took had excerpts from Common Sense on it in the 7th grade, which as an ELA teacher in the 7th grade, that's not a text that we would even recommend them using. So it's a huge change of what they're being expected to read and dig into.
And in 4th grade, the Lexile level of what they're expected to be able to read, it's huge. So, you know, I think we have to give our kids time to move forward. We have to give our teachers time, and we have to give our parents time. And until we really do that, we're going to have this major disconnect. But I think we're on the right track. I really think our kids are learning deeply. They're thinking. You know, I walk in a room and I hear kids saying, well, this reminds me of, and I'm connecting to this. And, you know, when you see kids doing that, you know you're on the right track.
Dr. Hardy, I was hoping to ask you this question. So again, last night there was another panel discussion that was had a little bit different feel than this one with regard to testing. The folks who were on the stage were very skeptical of standardized testing. In essence, were saying that they'd had enough of it, and their advice to other parents was to opt your children out of taking these tests. Their argument, in essence, is that the pendulum has swung too far, that you can't rely on the policymakers to check it into the place it belongs, that the only way you're going to be able to build pressure is by parental action, and if a large number of parents would opt out of taking state tests, that it would force reform in the system, in essence, by sabotaging it. Now, this is a small movement in Indiana, but it's been a very big movement in some other parts of the country. What do you think about this movement?
I think that I think we have to be responsive to concerns about whether or not public education is delivering what parents expect of it. Unfortunately, across the spectrum of parents, there are going to be those who are more sophisticated about what the role and purpose of public education is than other parents are. And I think that the system of assessments in public education is one way of gauging what our outcomes are. I think that we do have to make sure that there is a balance. So if you ask me about how I feel about it, I think that it's wrong for people to disengage from the system. Because I think the system and what it's doing, it should be engaging parents. And we have to make sure that parents understand that, because we're trying to engage their children in this socialization process, actually, of moving towards, I said it earlier, to become productive citizens so that they can contribute and be a meaningful part of the fabric of everything around us. So when I hear people talk about opting out of the system, it's a major concern for me, but I think it is a concern that people need to respond to. And I go back to the things I was talking about earlier. You asked me about closing the achievement gap. I can tell you when, as someone whose career has been defined by, the No Child Left Behind era, I've lived through the manipulation of proficiency measures and how in some places the scores swing wildly from many students in schools not making AYP to only a few schools. And I think that is the danger of a system that's out of control, and that it causes people to make decisions that stress the integrity of everything that we believe in as educators. So when you look at what is happening across this system, now I'm wrestling with some concepts here because I want to talk about the distracted piece a little bit too. Sure. So you put yourself in the dentist chair, and you turn over and you look. And the reason I know this is because I've been in the dentist chair here not long ago. And then you see those little shadowy x-rays up there, and you go, they all look the same to me. But then I'm working with people who, because they've been through a process of working with these distractors, they're able to look at it and they can tell me exactly what I see. Or you take someone who's doing a medical trial, doing cancer, research on a new cancer drug, and they have to adjust the pH values in a saline solution. So those are people who have to look at it, and they're not dealing with really clear-cut boundaries on their decisions. They're looking at the best-case scenario. Or you take it to another situation, and this is probably an example that will offend people, but I'm a combat officer, and I'm in the middle of a scenario. What I've got to do is take all of the information in front of me and come up with a critical decision. And I'm able to do that because I've been able to understand what it means to look at all of the distractors around me and come up with the best possible answer. So the idea of building a good test is certainly essential to making sure that we are delivering what parents expect in public education. But this is what I found about closing the achievement gap and ensuring that students finish our schools prepared to become excellent employees and leaders. And as you have to go from what makes a successful person at the end of the pipeline and backtrack that experience all the way back to kindergarten and preschool. And what you'll see is that there are ways that you can inspire children so that they have aspirational goals about what they're going to expect when they get in classrooms every day. You'll see that there are different kinds of experiences that stimulate creativity and help children to understand they have within them the ability to develop new things, to discover new things, and to relate to each other in ways so that through a community effort in a classroom, there's a buzz going on in there. And that's about the acquisition of knowledge and the development of skills that's very exciting. That's a very different process than one that judges people and labels them. So I think that what we've got to do is get back to a public school system that's not doing as much labeling it as it has in the past, and that it's coming up with effective strategies so that their workers, the teachers in the schools, can be successful. So if you're telling those teachers that what's going to happen is that we're going to use tests to help them become successful, that's a very different message than saying to them, we've got new tests coming, and we've got to be careful that we don't fail. And I think the messaging of all of this is very important. There has to be a way for the decision makers to communicate to teachers and to parents that the messaging we want to get out is what we're trying to do is improve schools by supporting our teachers and ensuring that children develop to their fullest potential. That's how you close the achievement gap.
Very good. I wanted to mention we can start to distribute the cards now. I'll be getting to questions in just a moment, so they'll be coming around with cards if you'd like to offer up a question. So Whitney, based on what Dr. Hardy just said, what are your thoughts about, we've spent the whole night talking about how to solve the kinds of problems that are real every day to you in your school, right? Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can take away from this that you could take back to Harshman that would be helpful in any way? Do you think you learned anything here that could make a difference?
It was really powerful to hear Gavin talk about his experience, and I think the labeling piece is a good warning for us all as teachers to always be keeping in mind that we talk about it when we talk about response to instruction. This is not a tier 2 student. We're delivering a tier 2 intervention to a child who needs help, who needs our support. Next week, they may not need our support. And I think this is similar. We don't, when you call a kid, this is a pass plus kid, or this is a fail kid, that it creates the wrong message around what we're trying to do. And so I think that's something that we can take back and that I as a coach can take back in terms of helping us have the right language and message around how we talk about kids.
Michelle Walker, I wanted to ask you about the opt-out movement. I'm quite certain the Indiana Department of Education does not want parents to opt out of taking tests. How do you react when you get a call into the Department of Ed from somebody who says they want to opt out?
Indiana actually does not have an opt-out policy. We actually refer to that even within our assessment program manual. We let parents know that certainly the school is required to administer the assessment. If the parent chooses not to have their child participate, the school is responsible for those students participating. So if they don't, that affects teacher evaluation, affects school letter grades. So we kind of let them know, here's some things you need to think about and be mindful of. But we don't actually have an opt-out policy that they can implement within our state.
So there is no penalty for the parent. The parent is able to keep their child home and opt them out, right? And that's permissible, even though certainly not recommended. And in essence, there's no provision for it because there's no actual policy on how to handle that. Is that right?
I think the challenge too is that we want to give feedback to parents about how well the school is doing in educating their child. And without having the testing opportunity, they're not getting a feel for how well those students are proficiently mastering the skills that we're expecting.
Derek, I wanted to ask you about this too. So what was interesting to me about the opt-out movement is in Indiana, we give parents a lot of leeway to make some pretty critical decisions about how they manage their child's education, even sometimes when policymakers may think it's not in the best interest of the child. For instance, we don't require children to go to kindergarten here, right? I think there's a widespread consensus that it'd probably be a good idea if children went to kindergarten, but we don't require it. We also allow parents, for instance, to withdraw their child and homeschool them, and there's really not much regulation on how that homeschooling works. So in that tradition, do you think it's a good idea to allow opting out of tests?
Probably not, but let's give parents, I think, a little more credit than I think sometimes we do. You know, we talk about whether kindergarten is mandated or not, and yet, you know, DOE a few years back studied this and tried to identify, you know, how many are going to, and as best they could tell, they were able to document somewhere around 96 or 97% of all kids going to some form of kindergarten. And the conclusion from the researchers was that's just what we could document. And we, you know, obviously we don't have records of where kids may have gone, or if they're learning some things at home, we don't have that documentation. And so, you know, that's always a nice, you know, story to tell on how we, you know, kind of screw things up by giving too much power to the parents, and yet the evidence suggests that they make some pretty good decisions. Same thing with homeschooling. There's some odd stuff happening at the high school level where there are students claiming to, or their parents claiming to leave to go homeschool, and oftentimes it's kids who have been struggling, and there are a lot of different aspects to that question we could dive into. But when you look at the homeschooling track record overall, particularly K through 8, which is where the bulk of where real homeschooling occurs, they get pretty good track records. You got colleges who are assigning admissions counselors to focus only on homeschool populations because what they have found is that those students do so well that they want those students coming. So, you know, once again, you know, evidence that the parents have made better choices than what maybe we assume they have. And some of these stories, I think, are by far the exceptions rather than the rule. And to your point,
yes.
I would hope that we'll find the same thing with parents. I think we've probably got some, you know, extreme reactions happening right now to a few things. So part of it is coming out of this Common Core debate, where people are using that as an example of how government's doing a lot of terrible things, and you know, that is one of the reactions that some of those groups have had. Well, fine, we'll just take them out. I think what we'll find is very few parents will actually take that action.
They should be allowed, though, in your point of view? Is this one of those parental right situations?
Well, yeah, I think but then they face the consequences. And it'll be the same thing, you know, fine, you don't want your kid to take the ACT or the SAT, okay, fine, then you figure out how to convince a college to be admitted. Later on in life, you know, you go apply for a job, you don't want to take that skills test, or you don't want to provide a resume, or you don't want to do whatever other thing it is that you're required to do because you just think it's stupid. Fine, you pay the consequences.
Speaking of consequences, the way Michelle described it, the consequences really fall on the school. If a student opts out, it doesn't really fall on the student. Is that fair? Anybody?
Well, I think it does fall on the student eventually. Like you said, you don't go if you are growing up with that kind of mindset. You know, I'm not going to take tests. I'm not going to make a resume for this job. You suffer the consequences. I think testing is important. You know, obviously the level of testing can be debated, but I think it's important for students to take standardized tests and like understand like this is what the real world is. Like you're going to have to do things like this.
There is a movement, though, among colleges to make the SAT optional. So, you know, if that's the case, if my child wants to, if I decide that I think, if I'm one of the folks, like there were quite a few of them here last night, who feel that this is a noble protest to sort of register concern about the feeling that the pendulum has gone too far, I would draw my child from taking state tests. I prevent her from taking the SAT. There's still colleges that will accept her given her total portfolio. So
Maybe.
is there any reason not to?
Maybe. I mean, the colleges haven't said, oh, we're going to do away with that and we'll just accept any kid no matter what.
Right, indeed.
They're,
Well,
they're,
and
they're
in
starting to
fact,
look at it.
of
They've got a
course-
whole battery of other things they're looking at, which may
They're-
include
thank you.
essays and whether they can write those. And,
Indeed,
what they did back. I mean, if they're not taking a college admissions exam, I bet you they're looking at other testing data from earlier in their career. So.
Well, and of course, all colleges will tell you like the testing is just a small percentage of everything they look at, and of course, we all believe them, right? I'm sure Gavin does. Yeah. So let me ask you a couple of questions from the audience. Michelle, this was a good question, and it was brought up by Dr. Cushenberry. The IMAS test is no more. Can you tell us a little bit about the rationale for that and how
Sure.
this is going to go forward?
We were disappointed when we actually had to discontinue the IMAS assessment. It actually is a federal decision not to provide modified assessments for students for the future, so we did have to sunset our IMAS test in the spring of 2014.
Scott, there's more.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole testing of special needs students, I think, is a broader topic, and we hear numbers. What is it, 17 or 18%? I don't know what the number is now on average across the state, the percentage of students who have special needs. But I remember, what was really telling to me is the state's longtime former special education director who pointed out that really only 1 to 2% of kids have an actual cognitive disability. Then we get into a lot of other issues that some of them physical, some of them behavioral. And I'm not saying that those aren't challenges, but there's students who have the ability to learn. And I can remember, at least during one debate in the State House, when it was being suggested that special needs students ought to be exempted from testing, that it was the parents of special needs students who came forth and said, no, we don't want that because that means it's going to be too easy for my kid to just be ignored. And that was coming from the parents who were concerned about that. And so what's happened, and this has been driven by federal law, and I'm not thrilled that that's where it's coming from, but what the feds concluded on frankly a very bipartisan way was the same kind of thing that our state special education director decided, was that when it came to special needs students, it was really only that 1 or 2% that really had a challenge to learning. And so there are some exceptions for up to that number.
But
that are doing the
The
IMAS,
same
testing.
person actually asked us to create a modified assessment, so we did.
but wasn't IMAS, it had less distractors, but it was on grade level.
Was for
So,
students working on grade level.
so as long as the students are working on grade level, I don't see that as a negative. I think that's what we should be doing.
I think the other thing, though, is that what's getting kind of convoluted here is that all students get a chance to grow from one year to the next. Yeah, I mean, that just happens in a variety of different ways. And the 1% or 2%, in some states actually have that, that 1% or 2% of the students have to qualify for not taking the state exam. That's about severe cognitive disabilities, which make it pretty near impossible for the student to take the test, which means others have to give you their opinion of what it is that the student is able to do. So an instructor of some sort actually rates out what it is the student can and cannot do. That's ultimately who those students are. But if you look at a student's growth over time, if there is some basic level of functioning that enables text-taking ability with a certain level of cognition, then we ought to be able to see growth patterns over time with those students. And I think that is the concern at the federal level, that many of those students were being exempted from the test, which in effect, in some ways, works to the detriment of the student in terms of where they're going in the future. And that's part of the thing we're struggling with here, is that what are the tests for? If the tests are used as predictors for the future versus guides for helping a child move into the future. And it's the latter piece is what we should be looking for in terms of what's best for students. Now, in terms of how they end up, then there ought to be some definition. You talked earlier about employers looking for a certain type of graduate coming out of our schools, but I would suggest that in addition to being able to do well on math exams and English exams, that there are some other kinds of information that will be very important and some other kinds of skills. And this is going to be a little facetious, but I'm not sure that algebra and trig are the routes to character. You know what I'm saying? And then once you get in the workplace, you know, you have to be able to control yourself. You don't want to act impulsively. You have to work in a reflective manner of problem solving to address the different detractors that affect your decision making on a daily basis. So I would think that what the employers want, they want students who've mastered that content, but they also want students who are able to have a vision for the world in front of them so that they're able to function within the organization in a very constructive way. That's the piece that's being missed in the standardized testing movement.
But I think they are trying to do that with the implementation of those 21st century skills.
I
You know,
agree
they're
with that.
really trying to build those in.
And that's why the business community has been so supportive and been frustrated, frankly, with what we've been doing in Indiana. Hopefully, coming out in a good end. But yeah, that's why nationally they've gotten so strongly behind those things. It's one of the reasons, because of the very things that have just been said.
Gavin, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, like it was it's not really relevant anymore. It's okay. It's all right.
No problem. So this was a question amused me because it calls out my John Glenn reference. But this is, I think, an interesting and fair point. The question writer points out that John Glenn is an awfully culturally specific name to put on a test. Now, I'll defend it in the sense that in Ohio, asking a student about John Glenn is kind of like asking an Indiana student about the Indy 500. Like, everybody's heard quite a lot about John Glenn in Ohio. But the point is fair, that there's often a critique that the tests are written in a way that's not very broad culturally, that sometimes questions assume outside knowledge by students that they may not have. I'm remembered of reminded of another interview I did once with a teacher who described handing out the state test to a group of students in an inner city school, and every hand just about shot up, and all the students wanted to know, what is a garage? There was a question about, math question about a garage door and how high it goes up and down. And all these kids lived in project housing right outside the school, and not one of them had ever seen a garage before. They didn't even know what the word meant, some of them. So are we worried about this problem, the cultural relevance of the questions and whether they assume a sort of dominant culture when in fact the students, some of the questions may not be relevant? And I'm going to start with Whitney. What do you see on that front?
I definitely think that's a concern. We had a question on a recent test that it was about falconry, and it asked the students about a man who was working with his falcon, and I mean, you could see the looks on kids' faces, just, why is a man playing with a falcon? What is he doing? So that's a huge thing that we talk about at our school with our teachers, and a concern that for our students, many of them, I mean, we're 40% Hispanic and Latino and 40% Black, and the rest of our students are Caucasian. So we are very concerned with whether or not the tests are going to have questions that they're sitting there wondering in their head, and they can't ask us, what does this mean, when they're taking it?
Sometimes it might not necessarily, it might be their experience. So it might not be after exposure they would have it. But a lot of what sounds like you're talking about exposure. I mean, some people, if you live in a high-rise, I mean, in the projects, you don't have a garage. So, you know, I just think you have to be careful there. It's experience.
I was going to say, I think because there are so many safeguards in place for a state standardized test, where every item goes through not only content review for alignment to standards, but bias and sensitivity for all groups. And really those are where any items are caught that would be a disadvantage for any particular student, and then they're not put on the test.
Indeed, the process you're describing, most states have that, including the state where that incident I described occurred. So it's sometimes, I think, you know, even though we have a committee that's designed to look at every question and determine whether there's cultural sensitivity there, I think that there's still a danger that there's some level of groupthink, right?
Well, I guess what I should also add is that then we look at the statistics for that item. And if there has been shown to be bias for any particular group, we don't use it in the results.
Interesting. So this was a a question that this this question references the country Norway, which frankly I don't know that much about, and says that they have higher educational attainment than the United States and fewer tests. And the country I know quite a bit more about is Finland, where they very famously scaled back their testing to be significantly less. And Finland, of course, is often cited as a country that rose in international comparisons over the last couple of decades. Let's quickly hit this question again of whether we think there are too many tests and we need to scale them back. Michelle, do you think we're at the right level in Indiana?
I think we're at the right level in terms of if we are really reaching for college and career readiness, we need to have some checkpoints along the way, and I think that's what the annual state test does. I think teachers, though, and several folks have talked about this on the panel, I think teachers need information along the way to guide students to make sure that they are learning the things that we're expecting them to know and be able to do.
I want to address the Finland.
Yeah.
In a previous life, I actually attended a presentation by the Commissioner for Education.
Pasi Sahlberg?
Yeah.
Pasi Sahlberg has a book. He was, in essence, the Secretary of Education in Finland. I've also seen him speak. He's quite good.
He is very good. It's a very powerful presentation. And if you remember in this presentation, they say some things about how they value teachers over there. And that is a very, very powerful statement that just in the pure economics of the situation, they're paid living wages, for sure, and better. And they look at the quality of life issues with their teachers and where they live and what kind of support they can give them. And the approach they take to education, when I heard him speak, and it was an important difference in concept. We talk about making sure students are prepared for public education. And we talk about it in terms of students coming in from pre-K into kindergartens. What he talked about that day was preparing kindergarten for the students they're going to receive. And that for me, that was a transformational statement. And I think that is, in a sense, what we're talking about here, how to best do that. And there are different ways to go about it. But in doing that, I think you have to value and affirm all involved in the process, ranging from the teachers in the classrooms to the students and the parents. And that's a cultural shift in some ways, in some places.
And I'm going to, of course, make Derek get into this question. But this is a pervasive complaint from the teaching force that the movement towards standards and testing and some ancillary changes that have been advocated for, it weirdly demands more of teachers, while in their view also diminishing their stature to some degree. For instance, there are pushes to lower the bar in terms of the entry into the teaching profession, let folks with professional work walk right in without pedagogical training and that sort of thing, while at the same time we want to add significant test-based measures that can result in teachers being fired or their raises being blocked. I remember Sahlberg, when I saw him speak, talking about his horror at walking. He asked in a school in the U.S. he was touring if he could see the teacher workroom. In Finland, teachers sometimes go on sabbaticals and they do research, and they have, in essence, an office room where they all work at workstations, much like all of our professional offices. And he said he was ushered into a room with like a lunch table in it, and he couldn't believe that was a teacher workroom. Do you think that there's a disconnect in terms of value of the teaching profession in the U.S. and the expectations that we're placing on teachers?
Well, there are a couple of aspects to this question. One, I mean, this whole Finland discussion is an interesting one. When it was all the rave a couple of years ago, one of the things that people just seem to skip over time and time again was that the way teachers are prepared in Finland is completely different than the way they're prepared here. There are no undergraduate schools of education in Finland. Students go off, they get a degree in whatever field it is that they're interested in doing, and then there's an extremely rigorous admissions process to get into a graduate level, kind of like getting into med school. Only 1 out of 10 applicants in Finland who applies to go to the graduate level school of education after obtaining a bachelor's degree in the subject they want to teach actually gets in. We're kind of the opposite in the United States, and it's at the bachelor's level rather than at the master's level. So it is a completely different approach, and it could be a thing that some folks in the United States might want to try, but that's a whole, you could do probably, if you haven't already, you could do 3 or 4 sessions on this.
We have another one coming up very soon, December 9th on teaching. So
good.
Everyone come on back.
Yeah, the other interesting thing too, I think we keep touching upon, but then I think we get away from it, is there is a lot of testing in schools right now. But how much of it is the state testing that's part of the accountability system, which seems to be what gets all the blame. And people say, well, yeah, but you got to do that to prepare. But there's actually research out there showing that schools and individual classrooms do far better when they don't prepare for the test. They just focus on teaching. I mean, what we've heard, folks on the panel say that educators want to do. Well, the research shows that if schools do that rather than preparing for tests, they do better on the tests. And they've done, they've done the randomized studies and all of that. This is, not just a couple of examples. It's not anecdotal. And so I think we also keep missing that point, that there are a lot of bad reactions to testing, but it's at all levels. And some of it is at the classroom or school level as well. It's not just what's happening at the state or at the federal government.
In fact, I wanted to ask you reminded me of this question, Michelle. We read about a study, I read about it in Education Week back in the spring, of acuity testing that looked at Indiana, and the study basically concluded that acuity was not a very good predictor of ISTEP results, and questioned whether the amount of money that Indiana was spending, and I think it was the second state, were spending on the test was worth it. But it was fascinating to talk to principals. We called principals, and they were absolutely convinced that acuity was predictive and helpful to them. Do you have any answer for that disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see the study, but we actually had done some internal work, and it was pretty high correlation in the 90% range. So I guess I'm surprised to hear that about the study. I think we don't have predictive now because we're using our readiness tests, and I think Dr. Cushenberry talked about the shock that even some bright kids are having with regard to the acuity. And that's because if they were using predictive, for example, the first assessment of the year was 2/3 previous grade level, 1/3 on grade level. All of the readiness tests are at the end of the grade level so that we can give better feedback about how well students are doing on the new standards. So I think it did what it was intended to do from our perspective.
And we used acuity, and it was spot on. So if we had a school at 90, they were just about 90. If we had a school at 70, they were just about 70. It was very predictive, and we used it multiple years, probably the last 5 years or so.
Interesting. Well, we'll go back to those researchers and ask them to show their work. We'll use technology-enhanced evaluations of their study. So this question brings up a very specific issue that I think is interesting and often overlooked. I'm not sure the stat is correct or not, but the questioner argues that 20% of American children suffer from some sort of mental illness. Actually, there's a citation to the National Institute of Mental Health Statistics. So the question is, how can a test that in some ways is intended to trick or fool children be moral and fair, particularly when you have children who are somewhat mentally fragile or perhaps are in danger of bad reactions to the sort of labeling effect that we've talked about. This is something, mental illness and other special needs, I would expand this question to include those, are something that we don't always talk about. We tend to talk about the general student, but this is those are fast-growing populations in some districts, particularly special ed. Do we need to make any accommodation or change the way we're doing things to deal with that issue?
I think that if you think about it in terms of what's happening with students in a testing situation, it's a pressure-filled situation to begin with. And students and children are just like adults. There's a range of reaction to pressure, from anxiety to depression, and it affects our ability to process information and make the appropriate choices in any given situation. So I think what we're struggling with here is this concept of standardization. And the concept of standardization actually goes against the idea of what it means to meet the needs of an individual child. You asked the question about test bias a moment ago. I would argue that in some respects the tests do reflect differences in cultural experiences, differences in social experiences, because they're out there. And the attempt to try to encompass all of those experiences in a standardized test is a very difficult proposition indeed. Earlier, Derek, you talked about how there are some really very good tests being developed out there. I don't know, they float somewhere between 0.90 and 0.95. That about right? Well, that's picking up 80% of the variance in test results. That means that 20% of it is not explained, which means that you have a 1 in 5 chance of a test, a 1 in 5 chance of a test really not being representative of what a student knows. So the question then becomes, is this test a representation of what a student knows, or is it a sample of the knowledge that the student has? And truly, it really, in most instances, is a sample, but it may not be a representation of what a student knows. So that's, there again, you have to back from these exams. And they absolutely are essential for us in trying to put together institutions that, in fact, are offering high-quality educational experiences for students, but they can't be used in such a manner that they judge them and create this relationship problem among teachers, students, administrators, and parents, because that's where the most fragile students lose, because people are apprehensive about them being in their classrooms as a result of that. So even the best intended teacher, people who are into this because they care about children, if in fact we lay in front of them a set of sanctions and consequences for failure, everyone is apprehensive about how these tests affect their ability to do their jobs. So for those of us in having these kinds of discussions, I do think it requires us to step back a moment and see what's happening to the institution of American public education because of the way that we're having this conversation, the way the messaging gets out, and its impact upon everyone involved in those experiences. So getting back directly to the question, I think absolutely that we need to be careful about what's happening to students in our classrooms who are differentially prepared emotionally to be put in this pressure cooker of standardized testing.
And some of those kids we know from early experience with them. We have third graders who are under tremendous pressure to pass a third grade exam so they can, go to the fourth grade. So we experienced this early on with kids, and so we know some of those kids. But, as kids are older and they have more emotions, hormones, we don't know what the impact will be. But certainly it's a concern, and we really should be concerned about students' mental health. And we don't want to test so much that it cripples students. So we do have to be mindful of that. And a lot of students who have a special needs or an emotional need, we know them and we can put some accommodations in place to support them. But then there are a group of kids that we don't catch, and it really means a lot to them to be successful for their parents and for them. And so it causes all these other things that it shouldn't. A test should not cause that kind of pressure for a student.
And also, kind of just from my viewpoint, all the tests I've taken, if I had a bad day, or if I am tired, if my mental is off, it affects my score tremendously. Last year I took the ACT and the SAT just for practice. I was a sophomore, but I was not mentally focused. I had a terrible week, right before the ACT, and that score was significantly lower than my SAT score, where I had a great week and I was rested and everything. So it's not even just mental disabilities, but mental in general.
Yeah, that student I described earlier who took the SAT prep class, one of the things that they were taught was to violate the SAT rules by packing M&Ms or other candy into their pockets, and when they were released to the restroom, to wolf them down for a sugar rush so that they would return to the test with some level of energy. These are the sort of things that are taught in test prep, which I thought were interesting techniques.
That student ended up playing for the St. Louis Cardinals or somebody like that,
Gosh, yeah, if only. If only. So I think we're closing in on the end here. Are there any last comments anyone want to make? We do have time for any closing comments. Would anyone like to wrap us up? Nobody has
I'd
any?
like to say something about, because I do think you touched upon something that's very important. You know, earlier we talked about whether or not students were actually being prepared so that they and our country can continue being competitive in the global economy, and I know that's a reality. The other side to that was what the tests have documented is a very stubborn representation of the Gordian knot of social science, and that's whether or not what we're seeing in these different response patterns across racial and ethnic subgroups is a result of race or is a result of class. Regardless of what you feel the reason is, the one thing that they do represent out there is they represent for those students a series of challenges that is going to have to be overcome. So regardless of whether or not the tests are good or bad, the fact of the matter is that all students are going to have to be empowered to negotiate these challenges they have in front of them, because what the world does is it provides opportunities to students in very different ways. And I think that we have to make sure that they're able to overcome the fact that the tests may or may not reflect their cultural experiences or their social experiences, because at some point in the game they're going to step out into the world and be adults. And I think the responsibility of schools is to prepare them to be successful in whatever situation they find themselves.
And I'll add to that by, in the interest of trying to end on a hopeful note. I was once interviewing one of the top social scientists in the country who works on testing, and the majority of this interview he was very critical of standardized testing, deeply critical of it. But he ended by pointing out that the correlation between your level of wealth and your test score is very high. It's 6 or 70% of your test score is correlated with your family wealth, right? But he quickly pointed out two things. Number one, that's on an aggregate level. So for an individual student, that can be the effect of the teacher in the school can be much greater. You know, while it may average to this, you know, the effect at local level can be very high. And also, even if it's only 40%, that's still a lot. That's a lot of effect that a teacher or a school can have in terms of helping that student achieve at a higher level. And in fact, we see many examples here in Indianapolis, just a couple that I love to cite. School 79, which is one of the highest poverty schools, has some of the greatest challenges in terms of, this is a school that's more than 50% of the school is learning English as a second language. It's got one of the highest special ed rates in the state, and that school's been an A for multiple years in a row. Their students pass tests at close to the state average. You do see these extraordinary one-off examples that make you wonder how that can be more generally done. So it does seem, even though there are many obstacles with regard to testing and many problems and difficulty in overcoming it, that there's some level of hope that students can do well, schools can do well, even in challenged circumstances.
Years of schooling has a higher correlation with those kinds of life experiences than even those test scores. So the longer you're in school, the more years of schooling you have, the higher your quality of life experiences are. That has something to do with testing, but when you take out the results of testing, you'll see that there are other factors involved in that contribute to how long students are in school, whether or not they get college diplomas, once they're in college, whether or not they're going to be successful in completing 4 years of college, that are very separate and apart from test scores. And then when you look at the standardized test scores, and you're right, 0.70 is a high correlation, but it only explains 49% of the predictive variance, which means it's just a coin flip.
Very good. I think we're at the end here. Let me wrap up by just thanking our sponsors again, WFYI, Chalkbeat, Indiana, also the Public Library, of course, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the American Graduate Project. We're all the partners in bringing this event to you. Thank you for the great questions and for coming out on a cold and snowy, I think this is February night, right? In February today? Thanks, and let's thank our panel. Thank you very much.